The night Hale showed up at her door, Zinnia Carr had exactly $14 in her checking account, a broken space heater, and a needle halfway through the hem of her uniform pants. She didn't answer on the first knock. She'd learned that people who knocked that quietly were either selling something or collecting something, and she had nothing left to give either kind. The second knock came harder. She set down the pants. The man in her doorway wore a coat that probably cost more than 3 months of her rent. He wasn't tall in the way that made people nervous. He was still in the way that did. The kind of still that came from never having to raise his voice. Dark eyes, jaw like it had been cut rather than grown, a faint scar that started below his left ear and disappeared into his collar. He looked at her the way people looked at columns of figures they didn't trust, but hadn't found the error in yet.
"Zinnia Carr,"
he said, not a question.
"Depends who's asking. Hale."
He said it like that was enough. Like surnames were a language and his was the only word in it. She'd heard the name. Everyone in this part of the city had heard the name, even if they were smart enough never to say it out loud. Hale, the kind of name that appeared in the margins of things, in the fine print of leases that suddenly went bad. In the silence before a loan shark changed his tone, she kept her hand on the door frame. "I'm not interested in whatever you're selling," she said. "I'm not selling." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat. Slowly, she noticed, like he was used to people flinching, and pulled out a folded paper. He held it out. "I'm collecting." She took the paper, unfolded it. Read it twice. It was a debt notice, her mother's name, a number that made her stomach drop 3 floors. "She's been dead for 8 months, Zinnia said. "I know. You can't collect from a dead woman." "No." His eyes moved to her. "But I can collect from her daughter." She hadn't cried at her mother's funeral. She'd been too busy calculating. The cost of the burial, the cost of closing the apartment, the cost of the storage unit where everything that remained of Lenora Carr's life sat in boxes that Zinnia had packed herself because she couldn't afford movers. She'd done math in her head through the whole service. It was how she stayed calm. It was how she'd always stayed calm. Find the numbers, work the numbers, trust the numbers more than feelings, because feelings didn't balance. She'd worked double shifts at the diner for 6 years to keep from drowning. She'd taken on bookkeeping for 3 small businesses on the side, a dry cleaner, a flower shop, a car wash with no reliable paper trail that she'd quietly fixed without asking too many questions. She'd kept every receipt, every ledger, every stub, and somehow still her mother had left a debt she hadn't known about. $62,000 borrowed from people whose business didn't run through any institution she recognized. Hale stood in her kitchen while she read the document a 3rd time. He hadn't been invited in. He'd simply followed her when she turned, and she hadn't stopped him because something about his presence made argument feel like a waste of both their time. "This was accrued over 4 years, she said. "Yes, at 30% interest, correct. That's predatory. It's the rate." She set the paper on the counter. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. "I don't have $62,000. I know what you have." He said it without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. Like it was just data. Like she was a column in a spreadsheet he'd already reviewed. $1,412 in savings. 14 in checking. You owe 11 months on a student loan you deferred. You take home $2,200 a month after tax. The space heater in the corner ticked quietly. She'd fixed it herself, partially. It worked now if you didn't breathe on it wrong. "You did your homework," she said. "I always do. Then you know I can't pay this." "No," he agreed. Not in money. She'd known somewhere in the back of her mind that the conversation was going to arrive somewhere like this. She'd hoped she was wrong. She usually trusted her instincts about numbers and people both, and her instincts had been sounding a low, steady alarm since the first knock on her door. "What are you proposing?" she said. Flat, not a question. She needed to hear it said plainly. "I have a problem," Hale said. "A specific, numerical problem. My operation processes revenue through 14 separate streams. Until 3 weeks ago, that process was managed by a man named Gregor, who is no longer available to me. Dimmer how? Permanently." She nodded once. That tracked, given who she was talking to. I need someone who understands how money moves, he continued. How to make numbers say one thing while meaning another. How to find where the gaps are before someone else does. Your work for the car wash on Mercer Street was, he paused, and she had the unsettling impression he was choosing the right word carefully. Elegant. She stared at him. You've been watching me. I've been reviewing your work. There's a difference. He picked up the paper from the counter and folded it once, precisely, and returned it to his pocket. You work for me for 1 year. Your mother's debt is cleared. You walk away clean, with enough to start over somewhere that isn't this. And, if I say no. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her from the doorway, like she was a column of figures, and he was waiting for her to understand what she added up to. Then the debt passes to collections, he said. And the people who handle collections for me are considerably less measured than I am. She thought about her $14. She thought about the needle still stuck in her uniform pants. She thought about the storage unit with her mother's winter coats and the ceramic owl her mother had kept on the kitchen windowsill for reasons she'd never explained. She thought about math, outcomes, variables. 1 year, she said. 1 year, I see the books, all of them. I'm not cleaning numbers I can't trace. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness, nothing that could be called that, but a kind of recalibration, like she'd said something that moved her from one category to another in whatever internal system he used to file people. Agreed, he said. She pulled her coat from the hook by the door. It was too thin for the weather. Then let's go see what your predecessor left behind. Gregor, it turned out, had left behind a disaster. Not the obvious kind, not missing money or forged signatures or the kinds of holes that screamed incompetence. Gregor had been careful in the way that only careful thieves were. Every entry plausible, every figure reasonable, the wrongness distributed in increments too small to catch unless you knew exactly what to look for. Zinnia caught it in 4 hours. She sat in the back office of a place Hale called the Meridian. A private club that looked like a restaurant from the outside and like a very expensive library from the inside, with 3 years of ledgers spread across a mahogany table and a cup of coffee someone had brought her without her asking. The coffee was very good. She'd noted it and set it aside and kept working. Hale came in at hour 3. He stood behind her and looked at what she was doing without saying anything, which she found, against her expectations, not irritating. Most people who stood behind her while she worked felt like pressure. He felt like weather, there, but not demanding anything. He was skimming, she said, without looking up. Not from the totals, from the variance, the rounding errors. Every transaction round somewhere, he was catching what fell. How much? She did the math on a blank sheet. If this pattern holds across all 14 streams, and based on what I can see here, it does. Approximately 400,000 over 3 years. Silence from behind her. He's gone, she said. Not a question. Yes, then you can't recover it. She tapped the ledger. But I can show you where your system is vulnerable, so no one does it again. And I can clean this up so it reads correctly going forward. That's not what I hired you for. I know what you hired me for. She looked up at him then. He was closer than she'd realized, and in the low light of the office, she could see the full length of the scar below his ear, the faint lines around his eyes that came from the kind of tired that sleep didn't touch. You hired me to manage numbers. This is how I manage numbers. If you want someone who just moves figures around and looks the other way, I'm the wrong person. He looked at her for a long moment. No, he said finally, you're exactly the right person. She turned back to the ledger. Then let me finish. The first month was the worst. Not because of anything dangerous exactly. She'd expected danger. She'd prepared herself for the kind of fear that came with proximity to violence. The held breath kind, the don't look directly at kind. Instead, what she got was exhaustion. Staggering, structural exhaustion, the kind that came from untangling someone else's mess, while simultaneously being expected to understand a system that had never been written down anywhere. She ate bad food at odd hours. She slept on a cot in a room off the Meridian's back corridor. On nights she worked too late to go home, which was most nights. She went through ledgers the way she'd gone through her mother's boxes, methodically, not stopping to feel anything, just sorting and cataloguing until the shape of the thing emerged. She barely saw Hale. He appeared at edges. She'd look up from a spreadsheet and he'd be in the doorway. She'd turn from the filing system she'd rebuilt from scratch and he'd be at the window. He never announced himself. He watched and then he left and she'd return to the numbers. Once, early in the second week, she fell asleep at the table. When she woke, there was a blanket she hadn't had before. She told herself one of the staff had brought it. She didn't ask. The operation was larger than she'd understood from the outside. Not just money processing. Hale ran a network that moved resources across the city in patterns that required, she realized slowly, something closer to logistics management than bookkeeping. She mapped it the way she'd mapped the car wash accounts, backward from the outcome, tracing each stream to its source until she could see the shape of the whole. It was, she thought one night, genuinely elegant, brutal in its construction but elegant in its operation, the way some ugly machines were beautiful once you understood the mechanism. She didn't say that out loud. She wasn't sure she was supposed to notice. He found her crying once. It was almost 3 a.m. She'd taken a wrong turn looking for the bathroom. The meridian was larger than it looked, corridors going places she hadn't mapped yet, and ended up in a room with high windows that looked out over the city. She sat down on the floor below the windows because her legs had decided they were done, and she cried, quietly, in the way she'd learned to cry when her mother was sick, efficiently, with both hands pressed over her mouth because she didn't want to take up space with it. She cried for her mother's ceramic owl. Still in a storage unit she paid $38 a month to keep. She cried for the $14. She cried for the space heater and the uniform pants and the years of careful math that had still not been enough to outrun what happened to women who started where she'd started. She heard him before she saw him, a quiet sound from the doorway, not a cleared throat, not a footstep, just a slight shift in the air pressure of the room that told her someone was there. She pressed her hands harder against her mouth, breathed. Carr. His voice was different at 3 a.m, still controlled, but the edges were different, less filed down. She didn't answer. "You're 2 floors from the bathroom," he said. "Take the 3rd left." She heard him stay for a moment. She heard him not say anything. She heard him leave. In the morning, there was a better coffee maker in the back office, the kind that ground its own beans. She didn't ask about that either. The threat came in month 4. A message slipped under the door of the back office while she was working. A photograph of her getting into her car outside the diner, the word "careful" written below it in red marker. She sat with it for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and called the number he'd given her on the first night, which she'd added to her contacts under H and never used until now. He answered on the 2nd ring. "Someone's watching me," she said. "I need you to know so. I know you know." She set the photograph on the table. "I'm not scared enough to leave, but I wanted it documented." A pause. "Where are you?" "Back office." Another pause, shorter. "Stay there." She went back to work. That was the most useful thing she could do, and she knew it, so she did it. She fixed 3 discrepancies in the Eastern Corridor accounts and rebuilt a broken projection model and drank 2 cups of coffee from the new grinder. And 40 minutes later, Hale came through the door with a different energy than she'd seen before. Quieter and faster at the same time, the way water moved differently before a drain. He looked at the photograph. He looked at her. "You're not scared," he said. "I said I wasn't scared enough to leave. Those aren't the same thing." Something in his expression shifted. That recalibration again. She was beginning to recognize it now, the moment she moved in his internal filing system. "The message is from a man named Driscoll," he said. "He ran competing accounts in the southern sector until recently. He's been destabilized because of the audit I ran." "Yes," she nodded. "I assumed." She picked up her coffee. "Will he be a problem?" "No," Hale said, "not after tonight." She didn't ask what that meant. She had the vocabulary now to understand the architecture of certain answers, and the shape of that one was clear enough. "Then I'll keep working," she said. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than he needed to. "You're not what I expected," he said. "You expected someone scared. I expected someone manageable." He looked at the photograph one more time, then folded it the way he folded everything, precisely once, and put it in his pocket. "You're better than manageable." She turned back to the spreadsheet. "That'll cost you more at the end of the year." She heard something that might have been, in a different man, a laugh. Month 7 was when the balance shifted. She'd restructured the entire reporting system by then. 14 streams had become a coherent whole. She could look at any section and see how it connected to every other section, which gaps were risk, which variations were seasonal, which anomalies needed attention. She'd built redundancies. She'd built checks. She'd built, without entirely meaning to, something that would work without her. A thought she sat with one evening and found produced in her an unexpected hollowness. She'd also started knowing things she shouldn't, not because she snooped. She wasn't built for snooping. It was too imprecise, too dependent on luck. She knew things because the numbers told her, and the numbers didn't know they were supposed to keep secrets. She knew who was paying protection and who had stopped. She knew which properties were purchased through which channels and why. She knew from a subtle irregularity in a single expense account that someone inside the operation had been feeding information outside it. She took that to Hale directly. She spread the evidence on his desk, his private office, which she'd been in exactly twice before, a room that was as spare and carefully arranged as everything else about him, and walked him through it. The irregularity, the pattern, the conclusion. He didn't interrupt. He didn't question. He looked at each page she indicated and listened to the logic, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. And she watched him process it the way she watched columns of figures, waiting for the total. "Varin," he said, a name she'd seen in the accounts but never connected to a face. "That's the account the expense irregularity traces to. I can't confirm the identity from numbers alone. I can confirm it." He looked up from the papers. "How long have you known?" 3 days. "I wanted to be certain before I said anything. You should have come to me immediately." "I should have come to you with evidence," she said, "not suspicion. Suspicion is worthless. Evidence is accountable." He looked at her. The scar below his ear caught the light from the desk lamp, a pale ridge against darker skin. The tired around his eyes was always there. She'd stopped noticing it and started noticing it again, the way you sometimes looked at something familiar with fresh eyes and felt the weight of it. "Carr," he said. "Hale, why are you still here?" She didn't understand the question at first, then she did. "What do you mean? You've rebuilt the system. You understand it better than anyone who's worked for me in 10 years. You have the access. You have the knowledge." He leaned back slightly. 11 months. You could have walked 2 months ago, and I wouldn't have had the leverage to stop you. She thought about it. She thought about the storage unit with her mother's things. The owl, the winter coats. She thought about the fact that she'd renewed the storage unit twice since she started here, because she kept forgetting to go empty it, and she'd started to think that maybe she wasn't forgetting. She thought about the new coffee maker, the blanket she'd never asked about, the fact that for the first time in 6 years she hadn't been tired in the way that had nothing to do with sleep deprivation. "I'm here to finish what I started," she said. "That's how I'm built." He held her gaze for a moment, and after is after, she began gathering her papers. "Right now you have a problem named Varin, and a reporting system that's going to flag inconsistently in Q4 unless I adjust the variance thresholds. Let me do my job." She didn't look at his face when she left. She almost did. On the last day of the 11th month, she found a folder on her desk. Inside, a signed document clearing her mother's debt, a bank transfer confirmation for an amount that made her sit down slowly, and a handwritten note on plain cardstock, his handwriting, which she recognized from the margins of documents he'd returned to her, clean and angular and careful. "You found 12 things I didn't know I'd lost. The debt was cleared 6 months ago. The rest is what you're owed. Hale, the offer stands if you want it." She sat with it for a long time. She thought about all the math she'd ever done in her life, The careful calculations, the survivable margins, the numbers she'd trusted more than feelings, not because feelings weren't real, but because feelings had never been enough to keep her roof on. She thought about the oval window in the Meridian's high corridor, and how the city looked from it at 2 in the morning, and how she'd started going there without quite knowing why, and how sometimes he was already there. She thought about her mother's owl, which she had, in fact, finally gone to retrieve from the storage unit, which was sitting now on the windowsill of the back office, without her having made any deliberate decision to put it there. She thought about month 4 and the photograph, and "You're better than manageable." She pulled out a blank card. She kept them in the 3rd drawer for receipts and notes, and wrote one line. "You're short 1 year. That's a discrepancy. I don't leave discrepancies." She walked it down the hall to his door and slid it underneath. She went back to her desk, poured a cup of coffee from the grinder that was still hers, because no one had told her otherwise, and opened the Q4 report. Outside, the city went about its business. Numbers moved through channels she'd built and balanced and trusted. Somewhere in the accounts, her mother's name was gone from the ledger, cleared to 0, settled. She worked until the light through the high windows changed from black to grey to the pale particular color of early morning, and she did not feel like the $14 or the broken space heater or any of the things she'd come from. She felt like someone who knew exactly what everything was worth.